SRA 211, Session 4.3.2, Organized Crime and the Sicilian Mafia, Part 2. In this presentation, we'll take a look at Italian organized crime, with a particular emphasis on the Mafia. First, we'll examine briefly the societal context in which organized crime exists in Italy, and then consider the three major groups, the Camorra, the 'Ndrangheta, and the Mafia. Moving then to the Mafia, we'll take a look at its historical and societal context, a word or two about its organization and structure, the types of criminal activities in which the Mafia is engaged, a number of anti-Mafia measures, including a very important and a big trial of some years ago, and we'll finish up with a consideration of the Mafia as it exists today. On this graphic, you can see an overview of Italian criminal organizations. You can see the three major organizations, the 'Ndrangheta, the Cosa Nostra or Mafia, and the Camorra. You can get an idea of the estimated revenue per year that these organizations achieve through their illegal activities, some data about their history and membership. And as you can see from the map, you also see the areas in which these organizations are centered. The Camorra is centered on the region of Campania, surrounding the city of Naples. The 'Ndrangheta is located in the Calabria region, and the Mafia, or Cosa Nostra, is headquartered primarily on the island of Sicily. Now, is there anything that strikes you as unusual about this map of Italy? Well, of course, you can see that it is in fact the southern part of Italy. These three organizations had their origins and have had most of their experience and carry out most of their activities in the extreme southern portion of the country of Italy. And there are a number of reasons for that. These reasons, or factors, are a combination of historical, political, societal, and cultural factors. So let's take a look at the societal context of Italian organized crime and the fact that it is located in southern Italy, which is colloquially in Italian called the Mezzogiorno, meaning the land of the midday sun. This is a term that is applied to most of southern Italy and the island of Sicily. This region of Italy is often associated with poverty, illiteracy, and crime. It's the product of very pronounced disparities in income and economic development in the north versus the south of Italy. As you may know, the north of Italy is far more prosperous, industrialized. It's the head of the financial services sector and so on. The south historically had been largely rural, agricultural, less industry, less even services sector. Accompanying this, or partly as a result of this, or perhaps it's even the cause of this, there has been at least the perception, if not the fact, that the south of Italy had been neglected by the central government in Rome. And that has led, not surprisingly, to an alienation from the central government. And it is in this environment, this region, the Mezzogiorno, the southern part of Italy, that these three organizations have flourished. Let's briefly consider the first two, and then we'll spend more time on the Mafia. The Camorra emerged in Campania, the region around Naples, largely during the 19th century. There were some antecedents in Spain and in parts of Italy as early as the 15th century. In history, for a while, central Italy was ruled by Spanish kings, and there was an influence of Spain over the centuries in central Italy. Whatever the origins, this organization has become an organization that carries out a number of criminal activities: smuggling, blackmail, extortion, road robberies. The corrupt Spanish kings and for a while the French Bourbon kings that also ruled central Italy in history really did not interfere with the activities of the Camorra. And in fact, as sort of absentee landlords, they began to include Camorra members in the public service. These individuals became entrenched both within the army and among the civic administration of the city of Naples and the surrounding area. And this in turn, coupled with the neglect first from the Spanish and then French absentee rulers, and later the neglect from the central government in Rome, allowed this organization to prosper. Further down the Italian peninsula, in the so-called toe of the boot of Italy, the Calabria region, is the 'Ndrangheta, an organization that is relatively unknown. Most people have not heard of it. It was first mentioned in the late 1800s. The origins, both in terms of socio-economic and cultural aspects, are the same as the Mafia and the Camorra. This organization focuses its activities on international weapon smuggling. It's estimated that 80% of Europe's cocaine, for example, passes through Calabria. So not only weapons smuggling, but drug trafficking. This is believed to be controlled by the 'Ndrangheta. And also a variety of sort of corruption-related activities, work contract skimming, money laundering, and various types of extortion and protection rackets. This group, although it is the least known, or at least the least publicized, is probably these days the most financially successful criminal group in Italy. The crackdown that we'll look at in a moment against the Mafia in the 1990s possibly contributed to the 'Ndrangheta being able to expand its share of illicit drug trades and other illicit markets. So this is the second of the three large criminal organizations in Italy. The third major group, of course, and the one that we will look at now more closely, is the Sicilian Mafia, in Italian La Mafia Siciliana, or sometimes called the Cosa Nostra, our thing or our matter. This is a criminal secret society developed in Sicily at least by the mid-1800s. There's some debate, there's some historical antecedents, may go back even further. At times, the Mafia has gone beyond being a criminal organization and has sort of exercised a degree of governmental authority over a specific territory, basically acting as a civic institution as well as a criminal organization. Interestingly, the word mafia can mean boldness, swagger, or bravado. In the original Italian or Sicilian dialect, the word mafia has a very positive connotation, something that's someone who's proud, bold, and so on. Like the other two organizations, the Mafia has to be viewed in its own socio-economic and cultural context. In order to truly understand the Mafia, one must look at its societal and indeed historical context. Going back to Sicilian history, it is noteworthy that the island of Sicily for many years maintained a societal organization that resembled a feudal structure, with large landowners, often absentee landowners, and a lot of very poor people working the land. On top of this, these absentee landowners were often foreigners. Much like some of the rest of Italy, Sicily has been characterized by foreign domination over the years. In fact, prior to Italian unification in the mid-19th century, Sicily was at times ruled by Greeks, Carthaginians, Romans, Saracen Arabs, the Normans from France, Austrians, French, and Spanish. So a society has developed that was used to having foreign domination. Contributing also to that more recently are some 20th or even 21st century developments, the continuing north-south economic divide, or economic disparities between the richer north of Italy and the poorer south, and going along with that, a perceived or actual neglect from and distrust of the central government in Rome. As you might imagine, these societal or historical factors have had an impact on the resulting societal characteristics of the island of Sicily and its people. For many years, and to a certain extent to this day, there's a very strong mistrust of outsiders and of the central government in Rome. Loyalty is not to any government, but rather to your individual clan, your family, your village. There are persistent social and economic inequalities, and perhaps as a result of all of that, a culture or cultural attitudes have developed that are based largely on the concept of clientelism, basically where not only do connections count, but connections are the only things that count to get ahead, to get benefits, to thrive and prosper in society. Now, the culture of clientelism, or relying solely on connections to get ahead, is not isolated in Sicily. Many parts of the world exhibit that type of culture or mindset to varying degrees. In Sicily, though, this culture of clientelism had, over the years and decades, expanded and come to embrace a concept of what is called mafiosità. This is this mentality that every transaction in the course of a lifetime is going to be based on some bribe, some favor, some aspect of corruption. And indeed, for many years, this corruption permeated every aspect of Sicilian life. Going along with it is a related concept of omertà, or the code of honor and silence. Basically means that Sicilians are expected never to go to the police, never to cooperate with authorities, never to talk about what they have seen or heard, and so on. It's essentially a cultural code of silence that only in the last decades has started to break down in the wake of very awful atrocities on the part of the Mafia and the resultant backlash that we will examine later on in this presentation. Given this cultural or societal context, it's perhaps not surprising that the Mafia has filled the vacuum from the negligent or absent federal or central government in Italy, and has become, in addition to a criminal organization, a sort of civic administration in some villages and neighborhoods of the larger Sicilian cities. For many years it offered protection, offered to right wrongs that had been done. So if neighbors had a dispute, they would not go to the local mayor, they would go to the local mafia chieftain. Going along with the culture of clientelism, positions and influence were usually for sale to the highest bidder, or favors were done in return for favors. To a large extent over the years, mafia influence had extended to regional and municipal officials, even to providing certain services. On the island of Sicily, volunteer fire departments are or had been historically run by the mafia. And they were compensated. They were not given regular wages, but volunteer firefighters were paid by the fire. Every time there was a fire, the firemen would get paid. This resulted in a rash of brush fires around Christmas time and other holidays when the volunteer firemen or firewomen needed extra cash. The Mafia was also heavily involved in illegal wells and water systems. The island of Sicily has been plagued historically and more so in recent decades by chronic water shortages. And while it is illegal to tap into certain sources of water because the water has not been tested, it has not been deemed to be safe, The mafia has gotten involved in allowing access to illegal sources of water. So these are just two examples of the type of civic institution that the mafia in many places had become as late as the 1980s. As you may have seen in movie present sort of portrayals of the mafia ran these activities from a structure that was known as the family, or actually various families. Throughout history, the number of mafia families may have ranged from fewer than 10 to at times perhaps more than 100. They would compete with each other, cooperate on other things. Sometimes the emergence of a new family would have to be approved by the heads of other neighboring families whose influence extended to neighboring areas. In some cases, groups have splintered off from another family and so on. And so families have emerged and others have gone away when they have either been co-opted or eliminated by rivals. Each family in the mafia can have separate business dealings. The dealings of the families can also intermingle to a large extent depending on how close they are to each other and whether or not they are dealing in the same types of illegal activities. But it is true that the basic mafia structure had been the family, with a head of the family or boss, and then an organizational structure with certain lieutenants who would be mid-level commanders of various aspects of the organization, down to a number of the so-called soldiers, who were the low-level foot soldiers of the mafia. We have already touched a bit on the various activities of all of Italy's criminal groups, including the mafia. Major mafia criminal activities include public works contracts. Historically, in Sicily, contracts were not let to the lowest bidder or to the most capable construction firm, but rather contracts would be awarded based on connections, primarily connections to one or the other mafia chiefs. Protection money, that is still the case to a certain extent, and it was a thriving business for the mafia for many years, where legitimate businesses would be expected to pay a portion of their profits in order to be left alone from the mafia. Drug trafficking, mostly in heroin but also in other controlled substances, was and is a mafia activity. The smuggling of other types of contraband, untaxed cigarettes, and the like, medications. And to a certain extent, and over time this has ebbed and flowed, the mafia would actually get involved in control of certain sectors of the economy, hotels, the banking sector, the transportation sector on a regional basis. So as you can see, a number of very lucrative activities, criminal activities, were undertaken by the mafia. Now, the Italian state has at times tried to crack down against the mafia. Back in the days before and during World War II, the fascist government of Italy under Benito Mussolini had actually some success, being a totalitarian government, had some success in curbing the mafia. But the mafia had been resurgent in the years after World War II and in the decades into the 1980s. In the 1980s, there was another renewed move by the government to crack down on the mafia. This culminated in something called the Maxi trial. The context of this was some inter-family warfare in the 1980s that really alienated some mafia bosses against their rivals and gave the impetus for a large-scale attempt to prosecute mafia leaders and foot soldiers. For many years, no one had ever turned against the mafia. But in the 1980s, there were several penitents, as they were called in Italy, people who were sorry for what they had done and who basically turned state's evidence. Most of the crucial evidence in this so-called Maxi trial came from one individual, or one pentito, who was sorry for what he had done, a man named Tommaso Buscetta, who has then been put in a witness protection program and so on. He was a mafia boss who, for the first time, a high-level mafia official testified against the others. The trial actually began in 1986 in Palermo, the capital of Sicily, in the prison of Ucciardone, which is called the Bunker Prison. It's basically a prison, a high-tech prison that was built into a stone fortress that was left by the Republic of Venice during the medieval times in Sicily. On this slide, you can see an image of this bunker prison. You can see the stone walls, but then with additions of guard towers, plexiglass. There were actually anti-aircraft missiles that were placed on the roof of the prison and so on. This was the venue in which this giant trial was held against numerous mafia chieftains. This massive trial that had begun in early 1986 lasted almost 2 years. Verdicts were announced in December 1987, and it was considered to be a massive success. There were 474 original defendants. Some of those were not present but were tried in absentia. 360 of these were convicted. Together, they were given a total of 2,665 years of prison sentences. Of the 474 defendants, however, 114 were acquitted, mainly for lack of evidence. So this trial was initially considered a major success, put many mafiosi behind bars. It was the first trial really to come to terms with the mafia as an organization, rather than as the prosecution of individuals. Unfortunately, though, in the years following 1987, many convictions were appealed, and a lot of these were overturned on appeal by corrupt officials or by judges who had been threatened or co-opted by the mafia. In 1992, however, all of the appeals were turned over to two investigating magistrates, two of the uncorruptible magistrates who had led the initial investigations, and many defendants were re-incarcerated. Defendants who had swaggered out of the trial or on appeal found themselves back in prison. These two individuals, these investigative magistrates who could not be threatened and could not be corrupted or bought, were Paolo Borsellino and Giovanni Falcone. They managed to take charge of all the Maxi trial appeals. Not only did they turn many appeals down, they reversed previous successful ones, resulting in many mafiosi getting rounded up and put back in prison. They also upheld the conviction in absentia against an individual named Salvatore Riina, who was the head of the Corleonese family, one of the main families, possibly the most important mafia boss in Sicily. So that was the good news. The bad news was that both of these individuals were assassinated by the mafia in 1992 in separate incidents. Very courageous men who gave their lives to fight the mafia. While these two assassinations were tragic, they actually galvanized public opinion against the mafia. These had been ordered, in fact, by the individual mentioned on the previous slide, Salvatore, or Totò in his nickname, Riina. Falcone was killed in March of '92, Borsellino in July. Their deaths really had an impact on changing public opinion against the mafia. Also accelerated a nationwide judicial investigation that went beyond the mafia into political corruption generally. This had begun in February of 1992, and this then continued. So these two men did not really die in vain. Their deaths really signified a sea change in attitudes, both in terms of public attitudes and governmental attitudes against the mafia. Ultimately, this sea change in attitudes led to a massive police and military operation on the island of Sicily, Operation Sicilian Vespers, or Vespri Siciliani. This involved the dispatch of 9,000 Italian army troops to Sicily, basically occupying the island. And this operation ran almost 6 years. During that time, probably 150,000 officials of police and military were involved at some time. The military guarded locations, really in a massive way reasserted the presence and authority of the Italian central government. The stationing of troops, including mechanized forces, on Sicily freed up a lot of police resources to focus on investigations and prosecutions, and many more mafiosi were rounded up, including Salvatore Riina, the boss who had ordered, it is believed, the assassinations of Falcone and Borsellino. He was arrested in 1993 and remains in prison. To conclude, it's safe to say that the combination of political, military, law enforcement pressure, together with a true change in societal attitudes, dealt, in fact, a significant blow to the Sicilian Mafia. Really disrupted Mafia activities throughout Sicily. Unfortunately, other groups, especially the 'Ndrangheta, kind of filled in the vacuum and increased its own share of certain illicit activities, such as the drug trade. Now, the Mafia was not eradicated completely. Perhaps the result would be to say that it's down but not out. While the Mafia had been dealt a significant blow through these police and military activities, Mafia-like structures and a certain Mafia mentality still exists or permeates parts of Sicilian society. And in fact, there are rumored to be continued contacts between the Mafia and elements of the Italian government on various levels. But the Mafia has been dealt a very significant blow through the actions not only of the investigating magistrates, but the resultant military police operation that took place in the 1990s.